Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Leaders Panel discussion. My name is Olwe Tukhani, and I'll be your host for today. Today's topic is very, very interesting. It's also it's a very vital conversation that we should be having as the youth that allows us to understand South Africa's past and coloniality, but also understanding progress within a democracy. So today we'll be discussing Mr. Mangosuthu Buthelezi's interview, The Political Leader and Traditional Servant. But before we get into that, welcome to our wonderful panelists and welcome to our audience also. I will ask them to please introduce themselves and just share a point or two that they took away from the interview that stuck with them. And Gina, please can you start off?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Georgina Walter. I'm currently studying at UCT. I'm studying a BA in Theatre and Performing Arts, but I'm originally from Johannesburg. My pronouns are she and her, just so that everyone knows. I'm really excited to do this interview. And one thing which I really took away from this interview is that I did history in school, and in history, when we learned about Buthelezi, I always learned about him in terms of the IFP. And it was really interesting in this interview to learn about his formative years and his role in the ANC and how close he was with other political leaders as well. I found that very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Please can we have Lydian introduce yourself, please?
Good morning, audience. Thank you, Olwetu. Good morning, fellow panelists as well. My name is Lydian Pleikes. I am currently studying at UCT as well. I'm a theatre and performance student, majoring in choreography. And what I had learned from the interview with Daniel Pleikes and Buthelezi was the different narration that comes from, and the different perspective that comes from hearing from the political leader himself, Buthelezi, and something that I missed out from learning history in high school. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think definitely I relate to that. He's not really an individual that they covered in depth in high school. So thank you for that. Mbali, please can you introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mbali Williams. I'm a 20-year-old second-year student at the University of Cape Town. I'm currently doing my law and politics degree. My pronouns are she, her. My biggest takeaway from this interview was definitely its emphasis on the political ideologies against the apartheid regime at the time, not necessarily being monolithic for all Black people, and how the different narratives weren't necessarily necessitated or emphasized as much as they should have been when we were in school. And yeah, there was so much to learn, but I'm so excited to continue having this conversation.
Thank you. Neo, please, introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is Neo Gumete. I just turned 20 years old. I'm also studying at UCT in a Bachelor of Arts in Theatre and Performance, majoring in acting. I'm from KZN and I'm back home now. And what I thought was really interesting in this discussion was how it does tackle traditional leadership. And I find that it's actually quite a KZN discussion as well, considering that like clans in KZN are quite a topical and political, have quite a strong front in KZN. And so talking to my family members, I just thought it was interesting thinking of families like the Gaba brothers and the Mpisani brothers that have quite strong political ties to the ANC currently, how they are being presented and their reputation as being upheld in KZN. So I thought that was quite interesting, the link to current South Africa.
Thank you for that beautiful response. Nick, last but not least, please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Good morning to my fellow panelists and my audience. My name is Nicholas Kruger, pronouns they, he. I am 20 years old. born and bred in Jozi, but I'm currently studying in Cape Town towards my BA in theatre performance, majoring in acting. The major takeaway I took from this interview, in the same vein as my fellow panelists, was that learning history in school was an incredibly one-sided affair, and allowing to see a different style or a different approach to the liberation struggle was incredibly enlightening. And also that one could even be drawing parallels between Mangosuthu Buthelezi and Julius Malema, both people who started out in the ANC Youth League, later on, when that relationship deteriorated, formed their own political party and went on to rather stubbornly resist the ANC at almost every turn. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to my panelists, our panelists. I think, yeah, definitely, I learned a lot more after engaging with the interview that I had known before. And I think I'm still going to learn a lot from the discussion that we're going to have today. But I think it's also interesting in today's discussion, I don't think we've really interacted with a servant leader that has fulfilled roles in like the realm of political leadership and traditional leadership, which is really an integral part of South African identity and South African Black identity and pre-colonial times, and just on our journey to decolonizing and really getting back to our identity. So it was really interesting just interacting with what Mr. Buthelezi had to say and how he felt sort of just the urge to stand up for his identity and his people, but also Black people in the struggle for liberation. I want to encourage the audience and to ask questions to the panelists throughout. Anything you have to say, we're open to take your questions, and hopefully we can all learn and take away from each other today. So let's get right into it. So Mr. Buthelezi was, like we have said before, a traditional leader and a political leader. He's one that spent many years in the political sphere fighting for the liberation struggle, but he also was sort of, as in his word, forced into traditional servantship as the leader of the Buthelezi clan. He basically embodies the two spheres, which I would like for us to really just dive into. So maybe we can talk a little bit about our understanding of traditional and political leadership through the lens of the life of Dr. Buthelezi. Mbali, would you like to start us off?
Thank you, Olwetu. I have to say, from reading about and actually watching the interview on Dr. Buthelezi, his emphasis on traditional and political leadership, he articulates as something that he felt compelled to doing. It was almost like purposeful for him. And I think it's really so, I mean, I think it should be emphasized more that traditional and political leadership can work in tandem, because the two inform each other in a really great sense, especially as someone who is Zulu and, you know, felt compelled to be a traditional leader for his clan. Like, he is the traditional leader of his clan. Trying to find like the synchronicity between balancing both your political leadership and your traditional leadership must have been such a hefty task, and was really commendable on his part. But it's also really interesting to see how much he let his cultural influences inform his political leadership, and later his political ideologies and his breakaway from the ANC into the IFP, right? Those were easily informed by his Zulu culture. But traditional leadership, which I found really interesting to read about, as almost like purposeful to Dr. Buthelezi's, you know, political career, or maybe his just like his serving career, to be perfectly honest. He described his traditional leadership as something that was serving to others and informed by his culture and his religion. And that was really beautiful. That was such a takeaway, because I think the two also work in tandem. Both your traditional leadership being informed by who you are culturally and who you are spiritually, and how that's what he made for himself and tokenizes his form of leadership.
Thank you. You honestly said it so, like you worded it so perfectly, how the traditional political stance in the struggle for liberation, I think you said it beautifully. Gina, would you like to maybe pick up or from that or share anything that you would like to?
I would love to share. So what I understood from the interview of the differences between political and traditional leadership, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that traditional leadership, it's more so you're born into, it's who you are as a person, and the fundamental values that your parents teach you, that the elders in your society teach you as a child and as you grow up. Whereas, and those values from your culture. And I want to emphasize what Mbali said about the two different types of leadership informing each other. What I really loved in this interview is how servant leadership was so brought about by Dr. Buthelezi, in terms of how he really took the time to listen to his audiences, to those who spoke to him. And I think that's such a strong aspect of traditional leadership, because, I just think it is. I also think traditional leadership plays such a large role in political leadership, in terms of influencing people in more so their everyday life and not just the political atmosphere that they're in. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Gina. I think definitely a part of this interview that also stuck with me, I think you mentioned it, is that, what has kept him going this whole time and what has kept his public and political sort of journey is his desire to serve. And I think when you have that desire instilled in you, it's what he probably, or what I understood from the interview, is what drove him to fight for his clan and to protect his clan and to be a leader there. So the two spheres really do hold each other up, and I think it's really enlightening to have interacted with the interview and just have a sort of insight in what all that is about. So I think now we can go on to speaking about his earlier years in politics, from his time in the ANC, leading up all the way to the formation of Inkatha. Nick, maybe you can start us off with that.
Thank you, Alberto. So yes, as previously stated, Mangosuthu Buthelezi began his political career as a member of the ANC Youth League. In fact, he came into contact with politics during his time at the University of Fort Hare during 1948 to 1950, which, because of participating in student boycotts, he would later be expelled from the university. Then 3 years later, taking the side of the traditional leadership of Mangosuthu Buthelezi, he would become Nkosi of the Buthelezi clan, inheriting the position from his father, which now we begin to see how his traditional leadership and his political leadership starts to intersect. In 1970, he was, between 1970 and 1976, he was appointed leader and then the chief minister of the KwaZulu Bantustan, which would later become somewhat of a thorn of his side when accused as a collaborating within the Bantustan system in the apartheid regime. In 75, he founded and in some ways also revived the Inkatha Yenkululeko Yisizwe, which was the Inkatha National Cultural Liberation movement. Apologies for the technical difficulties. And with that, it slowly began his independence and moving away from the ANC, because later on in 79, the ideological differences and the accusations of him being seen as a collaborator would really come to a head. And in 79, he formally broke away from the ANC. And as I mentioned, this is for two major reasons. Because he was part of the Bantustan systems and he willingly participated in it, the Black consciousness movement that was coming up during the 70s branded him as a collaborator for his collaboration. And as well as being somewhat ideologically opposed to the overall socialist nature of the liberation movement, being for the most part pro-market capitalism and pro relaxation of labor protection rules. And on top of that, he himself was not a proponent of the armed struggle, opposing the formation and the later use of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the military wing of the ANC. This would later lead on to the 80s, where, fearing an erosion of his power with the dissolution of the Bantustans as being a stated goal of the liberation movement, he started collaborating rather closely, which my fellow panelist Lydian will later expand on, with the SADF and the apartheid regime, where the apartheid regime and the National Party would provide training and military equipment to Inkatha Freedom Party members. And yeah, that is a brief history of Mangosuthu Buthelezi's early years in South African politics. Thank you.
Thank you. That was just really nice and concise. And I think we all have a good understanding of his early years in politics. I think, yeah, it's really interesting to see sort of how he started off in the ANC. I think I stand to be corrected, his uncle is the founder, but it's really interesting to see how starting at that point and developing into his calling to be a traditional leader, and how that influenced he sort of him diverging out and away from what the ANC stood for, and more into a more traditional servant based form of like political leadership, and how that just branched into Inkatha and what that stood for. So that was really, really interesting. Thank you for that, Nick. I think also his political life is very relevant to the late Dr. Nelson Mandela. So I think we can really tie it into that. If maybe, Neville, you can bring in the relationship, or the type of relationship that Dr. Buthelezi had with Dr. Mandela. Yeah, maybe that can help us a little bit further.
Definitely, yeah. I thought it was quite interesting watching in the interview him kind of explain the back and forth relationship he had with Nelson Mandela. And it kind of started with him explaining how they were not only like political partners, but also personal friends, and how Nelson Mandela would write letters to him while he was still imprisoned, that he later then published. And it was quite interesting how he noted in 1989, he received a letter about the civil war that was going on between the UDF and the ANC and the IFP, kind of talking about the internal war between Black people and everyone who had died, over 20,000 people who had died. And it was just made quite clear that him and Madiba did share similar interests in wanting to stand up against what was happening in Black communities, and have joint rallies, and just have a united front and like one voice between them. So there was really just an urge for a cooperative sense of leadership, and they saw value in like both of them leading together. And then it goes on to say how Dr. Buthelezi actually spoke later with the NP party, and one of his terms and conditions was that Nelson Mandela should be released. Like that was one of the terms throughout the negotiations. And so it just kind of shows his loyalty and trust in Nelson Mandela's leadership throughout the whole process as well. He largely aided and influenced Nelson Mandela's release later on, and Dr. W. de Klerk even confirms and credits him that Dr. Buthelezi really just kind of stood firm in his loyalty and like really wanted them to lead together going forward. So later when Mandela was released, they wanted to meet up, and the opposing parties kind of like threatened this, like their meeting and joining and sharing of like ideas. And so it like for a long time prohibited them actually meeting. He spoke about the UDF and ANC threatening and forbidding them to see one another. and kind of present as a united front until a year later, where they were able to meet in KZN and kind of talk about their similar interests and opinions, and decided to, from that point on, appear together at joint rallies and kind of just like show that they were truly a united front for the Black community. And even after that point, Madiba was further threatened by Dr. Harry Gwala, who was part of the Communist Party and also part of the ANC. And Dr. Buthelezi just further explains his disappointment with really this wanting and desire to just collide with Madiba, but the party surrounding it really didn't want that to happen at the time, and there was still a lot of internal violence between the Black community at that time. So yeah, I thought it was quite interesting. I think Dr. Buthelezi and Mandela had quite an interesting back and forth relationship, but there definitely seems to be a personal friendship and connection that was there, but it was just became quite politically, they just weren't seeing eye to eye on a political front at times, which kind of prohibited that relationship going further. So yeah.
Thank you so much for that insightful response. I think definitely it also touches base on what I wanted us to discuss next. What Dr. Buthelezi's role was during that negotiation period that was so pivotal in South Africa's journey into democracy and sort of the conditions of democracy. So I don't know if you want to just add a little bit on that from what Nemo has said. Mbali, would you like to pick up on that?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for that very concise and thorough history. Both you, Nemo, and Nick, that literally informed everything you had to know about Dr. Buthelezi, politically at least. But that really does, though, inform, and it goes to show just the contribution that his history and his relationship with Tata Madiba had in terms of his positionality in the negotiations. And I think above all, the compromise that he made in terms of not minding there being an umbrella organization, as he articulated, as one representative for the voice of the anti-apartheid regime, right? So of the liberation struggle. And that became the ANC at the forefront. It wasn't obviously the UDF and the IFP had their seats at the table to have this conversation, but they said, if we have to take one ideology, if we have to take one representative, who is going to represent our people? Who is going to speak on behalf of our people? So Buthelezi really making that, Dr. Buthelezi really making that compromise, I think, in terms of letting his political ideologies step aside for the sake of a liberation that had to happen instantaneously and immediately, so necessitated, because at the end of the day, we see that the ANC is the one that occupies most of the seats, and that they were the ones that occupied the seats at those negotiations. I mean, Dr. Buthelezi and Mr. Mandela had to put aside whatever political conflict that they might have had, and fundamentally, agree on the fact that they would have to be compromises that would have to be made in order for a party to end as expeditiously as it did.
Thank you for that. And I think we can then even take it further, leading out of negotiations into post-1994. We can look into what that looked like, the life of Dr. Buthelezi and his political career after 1994. Gina, I don't know if you want to throw something in there.
I do. I'm so excited. I'm actually so excited to speak about this question. And I think my fellow panelists have set it up perfectly. So as I stated before, in history that's taught in schools, I did IEB, so that's the curriculum I can speak on. Most of the time, I was only ever taught about Dr. Buthelezi in terms of the IFP and the ANC and Black on Black violence in South Africa during apartheid. But I found this question is so interesting because I didn't know the role he played post 1994 in South Africa, which I found really interesting. So after the 1994 elections, which firstly the IFP didn't actually want to participate in, and then at the very last minute they did participate in, and they had to change all the ballots. But so they got a 10% national vote in that. He became the Minister of Home Affairs for South Africa between 1994 and 2002 under both President Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki, which really just shows that he wasn't, like, he was quite cognizant of his job and what he had to do. Even under Nelson Mandela's leadership, he was put as president while both the president and vice president were out of the country. Several times he was put into a presidential position, which really shows that he knew what he was doing and he had a large influence on the people of South Africa. To even be considered for that position is amazing. But what most stood out to me was his contribution to servant leadership during 2002. So in 2002, 2004. I'm so sorry I'm saying 2002, 2004. His contribution to the HIV and AIDS epidemic in South Africa, specifically in KZN. So in KZN was the area in South Africa where the stigma for HIV and AIDS was the most. It was terrible there. Even during the interview, he mentions that a woman was killed because she had HIV. And okay, so what he did is he made it public that 2 of his children had AIDS, which during that time, no one was admitting that their children or anyone had it because it was so stigmatized and people were so scared of it and so scared of catching it or anything like that, which was ridiculous because, you know, it's just like any other sickness. Like particularly now, it's like COVID, you know, I suppose like in the beginning of the pandemic, if someone had COVID, it was almost like you didn't even want to be close to them like 3 months afterwards because we were so scared and we didn't understand how it was transferred from person to person. So what he did by stating that his children actually had AIDS kind of showed to people who knew him and his sphere of influence that, you know, don't stigmatize this disease. Understand that it's just like any other sickness. It's like the flu. Anyone can get it. Don't like create like a hatred in your heart towards this disease. And I think that really stands out as being a servant leader because he put his own children at risk. I mean, you know, like culturally and like in their society at risk of like being stigmatized. And he said this so that other people could follow in his footsteps. And I mean, Nelson Mandela did the same thing soon after, which just really shows the influence that he had as both a political and traditional leader in South Africa post 1994. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Gina. No, definitely. I think I 100% agree. In his servant leadership post 1994, I think personally, I've seen a lot of Dr. Buthelezi and his continued fight for traditional leaders post 1994. He's very vocal about how the Constitution sort of doesn't, I want to say cater, for lack of a better word, to traditional leaders to the extent that they should. And today we're living in a time where that really is like a tense conversation. It's a conversation of conflict. Traditional leaders in South Africa today want to be seen a bit more. They want to be seen. They want their authority to be affirmed in, their respective communities. So I think also that's where I took a lot of his servant leadership post 1994 in his continued fight for traditional leadership. So yeah, I think it's really interesting to see his political role and leadership prior to 1994 and how that sort of evolved post 1994. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that. Mbali, would you like to give us a further elaboration on that?
I think that was such a beautiful point that you made, Olwetu, which got me excited to speak on this point, just because the fact that traditional leaders are not accounted for so much in South Africa, almost, it's so telling of how colonial, like, we're still so deep-setted, as if there hasn't been that much of a decolonizing process, because our traditional leaders are necessitated in South Africa. I mean, we're literally in Africa. Our indigenous people are asking that our leaders have a seat at the table, but we all know that the world is moving so much quicker politically and like socially than tradition, than culture, that's where the issues of contention are going to be, right? People don't want to have tradition inform things like our parliament, or have our leaders, have seats at the table. Our traditional leaders have seats at the tables because there are probably points in culture that seem backwards, or that instill judgment in others, which is probably why, we have this kind of hesitation, almost like the skepticism of having like our traditional leaders be present. And that also got me thinking about the point that Nicholas made earlier about how his traditional, Dr. Buthelezi's traditional and political leadership intersect. And it's because in tradition, he was informed by his culture, his upbringing, the things that he knows as a Zulu man in his experience, and then his political, being informed by all of his ideologies, and him actually thinking, no, I'm pro-market, and like we should liberate our liberate our economy a bit. Like the state shouldn't be that involved, and how consequently he was then painted as a collaborator of the apartheid regime. Because we know that our NP government was pro-capitalist, pro the economy, and the anti-apartheid liberation struggle movements were very much with a socialist kind of like communist ideology. And that's the way that they wanted to run their country. That is the way that they wanted to run their economy. And here you are having a Black man who's not only participating as a leader of a Bantustan, as a homeland, when he should be fighting against it, but that was his calling as him as a traditional leader. That's why he did it. He didn't do it because he was an agreeable notion of apartheid. I don't think anybody really liked the system. I don't think, I think to condemn him to that kind of criticism, while just as controversial as it should be, I just think about how his participation as someone who faced a lot of criticism and was called a collaborator of the apartheid regime was really just doing what he thought would be serving his community and his culture. And he felt almost, I can't find the word now. He felt compelled. He felt compelled to take that seat and to be a traditional leader for his clan and for his people. And yeah, I just think I thought those are very funny parallels, just about how the political and the traditional can not only inform each other, but like you said, all the way to, there isn't that much space or room for traditional leaders in our current constitutional democracy.
Yes, Omar, 100%. You really elaborated beautifully on that. I think also it's exactly what you said. It's like people that critique or sort of limit the validity of traditional leaders in South Africa, they tend to say that traditional leaders, they struggle to sort of integrate with democracy in terms of the way that they want to govern or to have authority. So we see a lot of the times that the demands that traditional leaders have sort of conflict the Constitution in a way. And I think that's where the fight comes in, is that traditional leaders now are like, why does it not cater to me as a traditional leader, as an authoritative figure on this land, like the land of our people? So I think, yeah, that really is interesting. And it really, really is an interesting take on traditional leadership. And I do want to encourage our audience to continue asking questions so that we can really just have a proper understanding of this concept. But Nell, would you like to expand on that a little bit more?
Thank you. Yeah, I thought it's so interesting what Mbali and Oluwethu have said about traditional leadership, traditional leaders wanting to be taken seriously in South Africa. And I think it's not an outright or like dramatic demand from their side. I mean, I've noted here that like many people in Dr. Buthelezi's time thought it was treachery that he participated in homelands, and like linking it back to colonialism, like you said in Bali, like we look at an international landscape and the monarch is taken with such an air of seriousness, like it's respected and no one really questions their sense of traditional leadership when they have like desires to merge it into a political space. But when it's like a Black space, it's very like questioned. Even in internal Black communities, I feel like even sometimes other Black people judge traditional leaders and their way of doing things and don't really give them a serious voice to kind of voice what they know about where they come from. So I think it's like laced with a lot of colonialist ideas and a lot of just like possible self-hate, wanting to assimilate as quickly as possible into a white system and a white culture. And I think like it's just really interesting looking at like, you know, England, where it is actually so celebrated and almost aspired, like their sense of, it's so poised, like their you know, sense of traditional leadership. But in South Africa, things that we practice in our cultures are quite like looked down upon and barbaric, opposed to civilized and political. So yeah.
Absolutely, you made a very good point, and I think we need to be careful of being ignorant towards legacies of colonialism and apartheid. We need to be able to identify those things within our constitution, within democracy, because they literally are continuing, they are long living. So I think you made an interesting point. Like, these are the questions that we need to ask. Why are traditional and African forms of leadership sort of looked at that way and not looked at as progressive or sustainable or something that can actually like govern a country and actually influence a country in like a impactful and progressive way? So I think it really, really is an interesting point. Neville, thank you for that. Gina, I don't know if you'd like to give a little bit more on that.
Yes, I would love to. I really resonated with what both Neo and Mbali said. So I'll just go from what we've just been speaking about, Neo. Your point about in England about their monarchy and the way that they choose to govern their country being praised versus in South Africa, and I suppose other African countries as well, it being seen as not as modern, I think was fantastic. Because I mean, in the UK, there's millions of pounds given of taxpayer money given to keep the monarchy happening, to keep them running, to keep all of that happening. If that happened in an African context, it would be seen as not right. How is their money going to traditional leadership? That's ridiculous. They should be spending their money on what other things. But there it's praised. And, you know, if you even dare to speak badly of the monarchy, you are like ostracized and told that you're wrong and you don't know what you're talking about. So just on that point. And then what Mbali said about traditional leadership in political atmospheres. I know that in municipalities, traditional leaders who sit in the municipalities are undermined, like what they know, what they contribute is undermined in municipalities because they're not political government, like, well, they are political leaders, but they're not traditional, not in the sense of traditional in terms of culture, traditional in the sense of the colonial way of rising into political leadership. They haven't gone in that kind of way, you know. And I mean, if you look in terms of land, traditional leaders would implement and distribute land to different people. And that's been taken away. That role has been taken. The government now does that. But I suppose traditional leaders play like vital roles in administration of decision-making, law-making processes, and implementation of different laws, because they're the ones who are going to people and telling them, no, this is actually, you know, explaining the politics and the nuances behind it. And yes, that's what I have to say for now today.
Thank you, Gina. That was really, really enlightening. Thank you so much for the discussion. It's really, I'm learning so much, and I'm sure our audience is too, and our panelists. I want to further encourage our audience to keep sending through the questions and interacting with us. I would like to now touch base on what Dr. Buthelezi speaks of as the People's War that had left many lives lost. Lydian, can you please give us your take on the killings and Inkatha and the ANC? Just your takeaway from the interview in terms of that section.
Yes, thank you, Letu. Before I answer your question, I think it's very well put by my panelists previously, but I think I should also, in order to segue into my answer, I think that Dr. Buthelezi is a very prime example of, and his relationship with O.R. Tambo, with the late Nelson Mandela, it's very prime examples of the difference between the person and the power of the party, and then also the influence that either their culture or their tradition or their clan, in Dr. Buthelezi's case, have over their political life, their career, their actions, their decisions that they make for their people or their party. I think also in terms of what was just discussed as well, I will also try and give a broad overview on the roles that the ANC, that the IFP, that the youth all took, and therefore presented and allowed for this, as Dr. Buthelezi puts, the war of the people, and how that then complicated and created quite a messy history and sad history where, as you said, multiple people lost their lives. So Inkatha was founded by Dr. Buthelezi in 1974, and it was originally called Inkatha. And Dr. Buthelezi describes it to be the National Cultural Liberation Party. He said that it was influenced to have the same structure or the same principles that the ANC had in the beginning when they were created in 1912, of being peaceful, of being for the people. Again, he also reiterates how there was a that they claimed that the ANC intended to undermine the traditional authorities of traditional clans, of the different clans in the South African space, specifically the Zulu monarchy and the Zulu kingdom. And so that's what Dr. Buthelezi, in his history and his influence as a chief, what he wanted to put forth, especially in his party of the IFP. And that very much became messy in terms of the tensions that rose during the negotiations between 1993 and 1994. And then that also then pushes to especially the Shell House massacre that happened in 1994. I think what's also very important to present as well is that the NP government, the NP party, the National Party, helped finance this war. And I think that also then points that my panelists also put forth and that you also put forth all the way to was what is it about our traditional leaders that makes it uncomfortable for them to be in the political space, in this political sphere. And so I think that very much the influence and the financial influence that the NP had specifically during the negotiations creates this uncomfortability with traditional leaders in the political space, because it then it incites that traditional leaders and traditional parties are there to incite further violence, that black on black violence, traditional black on black violence happens because of traditional parties and traditional leaders. I think that's also another point to also make sure that the audience also understands what I also understood from Dr. Buthelezi's point. And yes, and then also, I think in terms of our traditional leaders also being in the space of our political conversations, I think the position that Dr. Buthelezi put the IFP in terms of supporting Mandela in allowing him to be the complete face of Black people in the negotiations, also then allowed for an umbrella term to be for the ANC to be the party for all. And so it's kind of then puts then the argument in, why would we need separate traditional political parties if we have this one ANC party that's meant to represent all? And that then allows for this discussion that we're having now, like, why aren't we accepting traditional leaders in this space? Because the ANC is not advocating for all, because as we can see in what my panelists have said before, the point of view on the economy and the run of our society and the traditions that especially Dr. Buthelezi and each tradition and culture follows is completely different to what the ANC has put forth. Yes, I think I've answered your question, but thank you.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for that. Thank you. It's such a fruitful response. Yeah, I think you did touch base a little bit on the violence and the unfortunate, lives lost during those killings. I think there's a lot of things that come into play in situations like that. It's the black on black violence. It's important for us to really look at it from a perspective of like where the power lies in that situation. It's always easy to look at something like that and look at it as if, these are Black people that are fighting against each other instead of fighting towards one common, goal. It's important for us to see influences of power, influences of white supremacy, of colonialism. All these things always come into play. But yeah, Lydian, you really did touch base on a lot of things, touch base on how the two parties, basically how they differed and also where they found the middle ground. Nick, I don't know if you would like to just give us a little bit more on that so we can really consolidate our knowledge.
Would you, can I ask you to please elaborate on what exactly you'd like me to speak on?
I would like you to just give us your take on the ANC and Inkatha, and maybe you can speak on maybe actually if we could just touch a bit more on the controversial and unfortunate Inkatha killings and the dynamics that you understood from your reading that you did about that and from the interview. So
all right.
Yes.
All right, thank you so much for the clarification. All right, so I think as Lydian has brought up and as Alberto has brought up and as the fellow panelists have also brought up, is the important thing to understand the power imbalances that existed between the ANC, the Inkatha Freedom Party, and the apartheid regime headed by the National Party. And I think what I want to preface this in what I'm going to say, I want to preface it with that the violence would have never been enabled to be as severe as it was if it wasn't for the direct involvement of the National Party in fomenting that violence, in providing weapons and training, and in some cases, the basic equivalent of military advisors to IFP security teams and their ANC opponents in KwaZulu-Natal. The other thing that one needs to understand also is that the apartheid government did a good job of fomenting violence along different ethnic lines, whereas we find that the ANC party was started and mainly inhabited by Xhosa, Black South Africans, and whereas the IFP was founded and mainly inhabited and supported by Zulu South Africans. We see the apartheid government playing off these two traditional cultural I want to say there's a word that's missing in my head, but the violence that would not have existed if the apartheid government didn't have a hand in creating and sustaining an environment where these two groups, which have no reason to hate each other, or have no reason to kill each other, but were pushed on and goaded by the NP government. In saying that, I think it is also important to remember that in some ways, the IFP, and specifically Dr. Buthelezi, didn't help in seeking out help from this third force in maintaining his power, because as I've read, and I stand to be corrected here, that Buthelezi feared an erosion and loss of his power as the leader of the KwaZulu Bantustan. In fact, one of the major reasons why his party was not in the ballot originally in 1994 is because he wanted a sovereign AmaZulu nation in KwaZulu-Natal, and only when he relented on that was he allowed onto the ballot. So truthfully, the history surrounding the violence is incredibly murky, because a lot of the secrets and government documents were either burnt by the NP government during its dying days, or in fact are still kept under lock and key by the current Department of Defense and the current government. And even though that the South African Parliament passed an act that I believe it was called the Access to Information Act in 2006 or 2008, South Africans still have a hard time and often have to go to court to release these documents. So although we can speak with some legitimacy and some confidence in what happened, the truth is a lot of the details are incredibly murky. Thank you.
Wow. Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. Thank you. I think I would now like to bring forth a question or thought from one of our wonderful audience members. And they speak of how many African countries have philosophies that tie directly to being a servant leader, philosophies like Ubuntu that many of us are, aware of. They speak of how colonization has shaped our governance in many ways. Even in the discussion that we had today, we see the influence in a lot of the events that took place in Dr. Buthelezi's journey as one of the liberation struggle leaders. The question basically says that, would we say that it is important to integrate learning about cultures and traditions at school before we integrate these cultures and ideals into our constitution and policy making? I think this is a brilliant question. Thank you so much. Lydian, would you like to pick up on that?
Yes, I would. Thank you, Owit, and thank you, the audience, for asking this question. I think, yes, I think in South Africa, we do not know, and as the youth of South Africa, we honestly do not know enough about our country. We do not know enough about the culture. We do not know enough about our traditions. We do not know enough about our country. We know about apartheid. We know about the violence that was prominent. We know about the microaggressions that were prominent in apartheid, but we do not know about something as in-depth as this conversation that we've been having about Dr. Buthelezi. And here we're only speaking about specifically the Zulu kingdom. We're not even going to the rest of the traditions and the clans in this country. And I think we need to learn as much about everything in our country, because how can we then have a true and fair constitution and fair political space when so many of us do not actually know about the details and the traditions and the opinions and the different ethics and principles that are embedded in our society, in my society, in your society, in Bali's society, in Gina's society, and so on and so forth. If we do not learn this at school, I think it's very sad that I need to now go out of my way to learn about someone else's culture, but in a country that I'm living in that has most definitely touched my life, my political life, my father's political life, my father's social life, my mother's social life and her political life, and so on and so forth. Because I think because it's our history, it's not something that we need to now go and fetch. It needs to be given to us in school because it's our history. It's not just something that happened there. It's part of who we are as a country. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Lydian. You've made a lot of good points. I think education lies at sort of the foundation of the undoing of certain narratives and how we view certain things. You know, how Black traditions are synonymous to being backwards or like not progressive and things like that. I think a lot of the problems that we have in terms of the narratives that surround Blackness and traditional leadership, all these things, a lot of them need education to sort of dismantle that sort of system. So thank you for that. Nero, would you like to quickly add on that?
Yeah, I'd just like to quickly add, I think it's very interesting what Lydian said, and also you speak about like this idea of having to go out of your way to learn about, you know, other cultures that exist. But I would argue that for Afrikaans, it hasn't quite been the same battle. For instance, like a simple thing like school lunches, things like Cook Sisters and Fat Cook are so like known and kind of like way more normalized than things like Ikuenya. Like I remember at school seeing this thing and like everyone's like Fat Cook, and I'm like, what? Like I've only been told that's Amakwenya, and like no one kind of knowing the terminology, other terminology, African terminology about these things that we have in school. And whenever it's like in language outside of English, it's almost always Afrikaans, and it's like Afrikaans traditions and things like that. So I just think like there is a point there, but it's like it's almost an easy way out to say you have to go out of your way to, and I'm not saying you were saying that, but like teachers who argue, you know, it's a stretch to teach other cultures. We don't quite see that challenge or stretch when it's Afrikaans. So yeah.
Thanks so much, Nero. Definitely, thank you for that. It's crazy because these are the things that we, as born Crees, you know, are still able to sort of identify within society and within our lives. So Gina, would you like to quickly touch base on that also?
I would love to. So just first on the audience member's question, I think not only it is vital for how did they say it? To integrate learning about cultures and traditions in schools before it's implemented into the constitution and policy making. I think it's vital. I think the school curriculum. Well, I'm speaking a lot about the school curriculum today, but I think the school curriculum doesn't implement enough about any of cultures in South Africa. I mean, South Africa is, okay, I'm in Johannesburg right now, and I know Johannesburg is the like Afropolitan center of the continent, you know? And then how is it that in my school during Heritage Day, I would just see a sea of Springbok t-shirts, you know, and it was almost like, why are you wearing your traditional tie? Like people, you know, it would be like maybe 5 people would do that and the rest would be like these Springbok t-shirts saying this is my culture. When in actuality, there was no room made to celebrate South Africa's vast and so like cultures, you know. And I think that's important. I think room needs to be made for other cultures to be celebrated. And exactly how Neil was said, I think so often there's a narrative of, yeah, you need to go out of your way to learn more about different cultures. But I don't think it's going out of your way. I think it's having interest in the people who are around you and having interest in more than just white culture in South Africa, more than just like colonial culture, European culture, and like Afrikaans culture. I think it's important to look to the people who are around you and take interest in your friends, in your colleagues, in who they are, in what their culture is, instead of just being blind to this, you know? Yeah, so that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gina. Thank you for that. I think definitely you made a lot of really good points. I think now, quickly before we wrap up, if we can just share our takeaway from what Mr. Buthelezi stated as the leadership challenges within the current political landscape. If we can just give our brief understanding of that part of the interview. Nick, would you like to lead that for us?
So I think one of the things that one should definitely be taking away from Mangosuthu Buthelezi's interview is that one tends to find themselves called to action not in the way that they wanted to or not in the way that they suspected. I mean, he is the perfect example. He himself would said in the interview that he wanted to do things differently, that he did not want to be treated as a pawn or ostracized by the apartheid government as they did to Albert Luthuli. But Buthelezi found a way, and although, as we have said in this discussion, some of his actions and choices were not the best for South Africa at the time, at least he found a way to break away from what was expected, from what was determined by other people for his role in society. So I think maybe the takeaway and the lesson we can see is that we do not always have to follow what has been prescribed to us. We can, you know, in a way, forge our own way. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you. No, you really made some really beautiful points. Thank you for that, Nick. I don't know if anyone else on the panel would like to just elaborate on that. Maybe Neil?
Yeah, I would say my takeaway from watching the interview was just his, you know, and I think we reiterate this throughout the discussions, is that being a leader is not a bed of roses and you shouldn't be doing it for status, and that really you are there to serve. And I think my most intense sort of interaction with leadership was in matric, when I was put in a leadership position, and like how vulnerable you are to crucifixion as a leader, and like how any wrong step can seriously like have a big toll on your reputation as a leader. And so I think stripping away this perfection of being a leader is like really, really important going forward, because then it encourages a space where anyone and everyone can be a leader, because you don't have to be a perfect leader. You can offer something to the table, just like Dr. Buthelezi offered, you know, his positive forms of leadership to the table, and Mandela offered his positive forms of leadership. You don't have to have this messiah leader version of yourself. So I think like just trying your best as a leader to serve your people is really important, and it's something that I continue to just take with me in future.
I couldn't have said that any better. Thank you for that. Lydian, you can take off from there, please.
Thank you. I definitely agree with Nicholas and Neil. I also think, for me personally, what I learned from this interview is that that you can't be worried about what everything around you is happening. You need to stay clear in your mind of what you think what would be best for your people. I think that's also quite a controversial thing to say in terms of what had occurred in the history of our country, but I think that it's also something to very much take note of and put in our back pockets if, as future leaders of this country, to really stay focused and keep a clear mind on what the goal is. Yeah, that's what I definitely learned. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Lydian. Mbali, could you also please elaborate on that?
Just to emphasize what my fellow panelists have said, especially on Noah's point about crucifixion as a leader, especially a Black one, and then all of the criticisms that you were almost bound to expect, is that there are no such things as perfect leaders. And I think the closest that you will get to that is the examples of servant leaders, like the ones that we've been studying, following, reading, and talking about for this past year. And they're near divine in terms of everything that leadership should encompass, but they're also humans. So they're full of faults and flaws, which is why in the democracy that we as a country pride ourselves as, we should be accounting for other people's opinions at all times necessary. And at the fact that we cannot have some kind of parliamentary or party like supremacy, I think that we could all inform each other, and that important decision making should have a consideration of different parties, because you're not going to serve everybody. So the closest we can do to that is to just be as considerate and as inclusive as we can, especially when we pride ourselves on things like equality and democracy in the state of our country. And I mean, it baffles me, but it holds me so upset to think that, how democratic are we if we're not accounting for the voices of our traditional leaders? Especially since traditional leaders inform and lead the majority of the people in this country. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that, Mbali. Really wise words from your side. Thank you to all the panelists. I think you really shared a lot of different but similar takeaways from the interviews in terms of also what our role is as the youth. And it's been really like an honor to host this discussion and learn from you guys, and also to have interacted with the interview with Dr. Buthelezi, and to have the platform of servant leader, carrying on the legacy of the late Professor Plaatjies. And that concludes our discussion on political leadership and being a traditional servant leader through the lens of the life of Dr. Mangosuthu Buthelezi. I'd like to thank everyone for taking their time to join this discussion, for contributing, our amazing panelists. Please do make sure to follow Servant Leader on all the social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, to visit the Servant Leader website at www.servantleader.co.za. And please do join us for our next conversation on December 16th on the topical issue of gender-based violence. It's going to be a big one. Thank you so much, and stay well.